The wind howled across the barren plains of Valoranine, a distant alien planet where night stretched longer than day. Beneath the pale glow of 2 moons, Amara stood alone at the edge of her family's grand estate. Her 3 hearts pounded in her chest, but her face remained calm. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration. Her father, General Kalin, had returned from a victorious war. The entire family had gathered inside the estate, their laughter echoing through the marble halls. But Amara wasn't welcome. Through the large glass windows, she could see her siblings, tall, elegant, and dressed in shimmering robes, raising their glasses to toast their father's success. Amara used to stand beside them, her robes just as bright. But that was before she refused to follow the family's path, before she chose honor over power. A soft crunch sounded behind her. Amara turned sharply, but it was only the house servant, Thaler. He avoided her gaze as he set a small satchel of food on the ground. "Your father said you should leave tonight," Thaler whispered. His voice trembled. Amara swallowed hard. "Did he say why?" Thaler hesitated. "You brought shame to his name. That's reason enough." Amara's eyes drifted back to the window. Her father, a tall, fierce alien with dark ridges along his arms, stood at the center of the room. His gaze met hers through the glass. His expression was cold, distant, as if he were looking at a stranger. "Tell him I understand," Amara said softly. She bent down to pick up the satchel. As she turned to leave, Thaler spoke again. "Amara, be careful out there. They say the Valoran hunters have been seen near the cliffs." "I'll be fine," she replied, though she wasn't sure if she believed it. The gates of the estate hissed open, and Amara stepped into the freezing night. The path ahead stretched into the dark wilderness, where shadows shifted beneath the silver moonlight. Each step felt heavier than the last. Amara had known this day would come. Her family believed in power above all else. They made alliances with dangerous clans, profited from illegal trade, and used their influence to crush those who stood in their way. Amara could have joined them. Her father had offered her a seat at the table many times. But Amara refused. She couldn't turn a blind eye to the suffering their actions caused. Last month, she did the unthinkable. She warned a rival clan of her family's attack. The rivals escaped, but Amara's betrayal was discovered. She thought her father would forgive her. After all, she was his daughter. She was wrong. The forest grew thicker as Amara walked deeper into the wild. She pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders, the fabric offering little protection from the biting cold. Somewhere in the distance, an animal howled. Suddenly, Amara felt something. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't a shadow. It was a feeling, as if unseen eyes were watching her. She stopped and looked around. The forest was silent. But Amara knew better. She wasn't alone. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice firm. No answer. Her gaze drifted to the trees. Strange markings scratched into the bark glowed faintly under the moonlight. She recognized them. Hunter symbols. A warning. She was being tracked. Amara's grip tightened around the satchel. She quickened her pace, hoping to put as much distance between herself and the watchers as possible. But the feeling didn't leave. By the time Amara reached the cliffs, the moons hung high overhead. She sat down on a jagged rock, staring out at the endless expanse of stars. A memory surfaced. When she was a child, her father would bring her here. He used to say that the stars held stories of warriors long gone, and that one day she would write her own. Amara used to believe him. Now she wasn't sure what her story would be. A rustling sound broke her thoughts. She spun around. Standing at the edge of the trees was a figure, cloaked in shadows. Amara's heart raced, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I know you're there," she said. The figure stepped forward, slowly pulling back the hood. It wasn't a Valoran hunter. It wasn't one of her siblings. It was a human. Tall, scared, and carrying a long metal staff. The man's eyes locked with Amara's. He didn't speak, but there was something familiar about his gaze. something that told Amara he wasn't here to harm her. Still, she didn't lower her guard. The man studied her for a long moment. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared into the forest. Amara stayed by the cliffs until the sky began to brighten. But the memory of the human lingered. Who was he? And why did he look at her like he already knew her story? The forest felt alive at night, not in the comforting way of gentle winds or distant wildlife, but with a cold, unrelenting presence that followed Amara's every step. The deeper she walked, the heavier the air became, like the weight of invisible hands pressing down on her shoulders. The trees whispered with the wind, their twisted branches clawing at the dark sky. Moonlight barely reached the forest floor, leaving only faint streaks of silver that disappeared the moment Amara moved past them. She had been walking for hours. Her alien senses, sharper than any human's, caught the softest sounds, the crunch of leaves, the distant crack of a branch. But she saw nothing. The markings she passed earlier hadn't faded from her mind. Hunters were nearby. Velaran hunters. They didn't just track exiles like her. They hunted them for sport. Amara shifted the satchel on her back. The small amount of food inside wouldn't last long. If she didn't find shelter by morning, hunger wouldn't be her only problem. The wind shifted, carrying with it a scent Amara recognized immediately: metal and ozone. A weapon. She froze. Somewhere to her left, a figure stood hidden among the trees. She couldn't see them, but she felt their gaze as if it were a knife against her skin. Amara's hand drifted to the small blade tucked beneath her cloak. She gripped the handle, fingers cold against the steel. "Come out," she said, voice steady despite the fear curling in her chest. Silence. The shadows didn't move, but they didn't disappear either. Amara stepped back slowly, her eyes locked on the spot where she felt the figure's presence. She moved carefully, keeping her steps light against the forest floor. A few more paces. Then she ran. Branches whipped against her face as she sprinted through the woods, her breath forming small clouds in the freezing air. The satchel bounced against her back, but she didn't dare stop to adjust it. She heard the soft crunch of footsteps behind her. The hunter wasn't far. Amara weaved between the trees, her heart pounding in her ears. Her alien physiology allowed her to move faster than most creatures, but she knew Velaran hunters weren't ordinary trackers. They moved like ghosts, blending into the environment so well that even trained soldiers feared them. A flash of silver shot past her head, striking the tree beside her. Amara ducked, rolling into the underbrush. Her cloak snagged on thorns, but she tore herself free, ignoring the sharp sting as fabric ripped away. She didn't stop running. The forest began to thin, and ahead, she saw the faint outline of a rocky clearing. Amara pushed forward, heart leaping at the sight. If she could reach the open ground, she'd have a chance to escape. The hunters wouldn't risk exposing themselves in clear view, or so she thought. As she burst into the clearing, she skidded to a halt. Another figure stood waiting. Tall and silent, cloaked in shadows, the figure held a long staff, the tip glowing faintly with energy. His stance was relaxed, but there was something unsettling about his calmness. Amara's grip tightened on her blade. She wasn't going to run anymore. "Who are you?" she demanded, stepping forward. The figure said nothing. Moonlight crept across his face, revealing features Amara didn't expect. Human features. His skin was pale, marked by scars that crossed his jaw and brow. His eyes, dark and calculating, watched her without blinking. A human. On Valoranine. Amara's blade lowered slightly. Humans rarely set foot on her planet, and when they did, they didn't survive long. Her people didn't trust them. But something about this man was different. He didn't look afraid. Before Amara could speak again, he raised his hand, palm facing upward. A silent gesture, but clear. "Wait." Amara's eyes narrowed. Then behind her, she heard it. A soft rustling in the bushes, followed by the low growl of something far more dangerous than a hunter. Slowly, Amara turned her head. Emerging from the darkness was a creature unlike anything she'd seen before. Towering on 4 legs, its skin rippled like liquid metal beneath the moonlight. Glowing yellow eyes fixed on her, and sharp tendrils curled around its mouth, dripping with acid that hissed against the ground. A star beast. Her blade felt small in her hands. The human took a step forward, placing himself between Amara and the creature. He didn't speak, but his body shifted into a defensive stance, as if this wasn't the first time he had faced something like this. The star beast growled, but it didn't attack. Not yet. Amara's eyes flicked between the man and the beast, her mind racing. She didn't trust him, but she trusted the creature behind her even less. "Stay low," the man finally spoke, his voice calm. "And don't run." Amara hesitated, but as the star beast stepped closer, she realized she had no choice. She lowered herself beside him, blade still in hand. For the first time in days, she wasn't alone. The star beast circled the clearing, its glowing eyes fixed on Amara, and the human standing beside her. Each step the creature took left deep marks in the rocky soil, its claws cutting into stone as if it were soft clay. Amara kept her body low, as the human had instructed, but her grip on the blade tightened. The star beast's tendrils twitched, releasing drops of acid that sizzled and smoked upon contact with the ground. The human, calm and unmoving, watched the beast without flinching. "Don't make sudden movements," he said, his voice steady but quiet. "It's testing us." Amara's gaze flickered toward him. His tone carried the weight of experience, the kind that only came from surviving far too many close encounters. "How do you know that?" she whispered. The man didn't answer immediately. His focus remained on the star beast, but after a long pause, he finally said, "Because I've faced one before." Amara's eyes widened. Facing a star beast and surviving was rare. Most who crossed paths with the deadly creatures didn't live to tell the tale. The star beast took another step forward, the ground trembling beneath its weight. Its head lowered, nostrils flaring as it sniffed the air. The human slowly shifted his staff, tapping the ground with its metal tip. The faint glow along its length pulsed, sending a ripple of light across the clearing. The star beast stopped. It tilted its head, letting out a deep growl that echoed through the forest, but it didn't advance. "What did you do?" Amara asked, her voice barely audible. "Distracted it," the man replied. "It won't stay long if it thinks we aren't prey." Amara doubted that. Star beasts weren't known for leaving empty-handed. They either killed or chased until their targets collapsed from exhaustion. Yet, to her surprise, the star beast let out a low snarl and slowly began to retreat into the darkness. Its glowing eyes lingered on them for a few moments before disappearing among the trees. Amara exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The clearing fell silent once more, save for the distant rustling of leaves as the creature vanished into the woods. "You saved my life," Amara admitted, standing upright. The human didn't respond. He adjusted his staff, slinging it over his shoulder as he began walking away, as if the encounter had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "Wait," Amara called after him. "Who are you?" The man paused but didn't turn around. His head tilted slightly, and after a long silence, he answered, "Elias." "Elias," she repeated, taking a step closer. "You're human. What are you doing on Valora 9? Finally, Elias turned to face her. His dark eyes met hers, and for the first time, Amara noticed the faint scars running along his jaw and neck, disappearing beneath his cloak. "I could ask you the same thing," he said. "Valora doesn't seem like a friendly place for someone wandering alone." Amara hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "I didn't have a choice," she admitted. "I was exiled." Elias raised an eyebrow. "Exiled? From where?" Amara shifted uncomfortably. She didn't want to speak of her family, but something about Elias's gaze made her feel as though lying wouldn't work. "My family is powerful," she said carefully. "I refuse to follow their methods. So, They cast me out. Elias studied her for a long moment before nodding. I see. Amara crossed her arms. And you? What's a human doing all the way out here? Humans rarely survive long on this planet. Elias smirked faintly. I've been here long enough to know the rules. That's not an answer. He shrugged. I'm a mercenary. Valora has its fair share of work for someone like me. Dangerous, but profitable. Amara narrowed her eyes. Mercenaries usually take jobs for the highest bidder. Is that why you're helping me? Elias's smirk faded. No. She waited for him to explain, but he didn't. Instead, Elias gestured toward the trees. It's not safe here. The star beast might not come back, but the hunters will. Amara glanced toward the woods, remembering the strange markings she had seen earlier. You know about the hunters? She asked. Elias nodded. They've been following you since you left the estate. Amara's heart sank. How do you know that? I saw them hours ago. They stayed hidden, but they're patient. If I hadn't stepped in, they would have struck before dawn. The weight of his words settled heavily on her shoulders. Amara had suspected she was being watched, but hearing it confirmed sent a chill down her spine. Where can I go? She asked. Elias turned toward the path leading deeper into the forest. I know a place. It's not far, but we'll have to move quickly. Amara hesitated for only a moment before following him. As they walked, the forest grew quieter. The further they traveled, the more distant the estate felt, like a memory from another life. Elias led her through narrow trails and over streams, his movements precise and silent. Amara couldn't help but notice the way he moved, as if he had been walking these paths for years. After some time, they reached a hidden cave nestled beneath a cluster of thick vines. Elias pulled them aside, revealing a small entrance just large enough for them to slip through. Inside, the cave was dim but warm. A small fire crackled in the corner, illuminating a makeshift sleeping area and a collection of supplies. You live here? Amara asked, raising an eyebrow. It's temporary, Elias replied, dropping his satchel by the fire. I don't stay in one place for too long. Amara lowered herself by the flames, letting the warmth seep into her cold skin. For the first time since leaving the estate, she felt a sense of safety, fragile but present. Elias sat across from her, sharpening his staff with a small tool. As the fire crackled between them, Amara finally broke the silence. Why did you save me? She asked. Elias glanced up, his eyes reflecting the firelight. Because, he said simply, someone once did the same for me. The flickering light of the fire danced across the cave walls, casting long shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. Amara sat cross-legged near the flames, watching Elias sharpen his staff with slow, deliberate strokes. The metallic hum of the blade against stone filled the silence between them. She had been in the cave for 3 days now, and although Elias rarely spoke, his presence brought an odd sense of comfort. He didn't ask unnecessary questions. He didn't pry into her past. But Amara could feel the weight of his gaze when he thought she wasn't looking. Outside the cave, the forest had grown quieter. The distant howls that once echoed through the night were gone, replaced by an eerie stillness that left Amara uneasy. She had learned to trust her instincts, and right now, they were screaming that something was wrong. Elias, she said softly, breaking the silence. You said the hunters were following me. Why haven't they attacked yet? Elias didn't glance up from his work. Because they're waiting for the right moment. They know I'm here. Amara frowned. And that stops them. It slows them down, he replied. Hunters don't like fair fights. They prefer to corner their prey. Amara shifted uncomfortably. She wasn't used to being considered prey. Her family had always been the predators. Powerful, untouchable. But out here, stripped of her name and status, she was just another target. Elias set his staff aside and stood, stretching his arms. You should rest, he said, his tone softening. I'll keep watch tonight. Amara nodded, though she doubted she would sleep. She lay down by the fire, wrapping herself in the thin blanket Elias had given her. As she closed her eyes, the images of her family's estate crept into her mind. The tall marble pillars, the glowing chandeliers, the cold stare of her father as he cast her out. She pushed the memories away. Tonight, she wasn't in exile. She was a survivor. Amara's eyes snapped open to the sound of rustling outside the cave. The fire had burned low, casting only faint light across the rocky floor. Elias sat near the entrance, his silhouette barely visible in the dim glow. He hadn't moved, but Amara could sense the tension in his posture. "They're here," Elias said quietly, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Amara sat up, heart racing. "How many?" she whispered. "3," Elias replied. "Maybe 4." Amara's hand drifted to the small blade she kept tucked beneath her cloak. Elias glanced over his shoulder. "Stay here. Don't come out until I call for you." Amara's instincts screamed against the idea of hiding, but she nodded, knowing she would only be a liability if she followed him. Elias stood, pulling his staff from the wall, and slipping out into the cold night air without another word. Amara crawled toward the cave entrance, keeping low as she peered outside. The forest was bathed in moonlight, casting long silver streaks across the ground. At first, she saw nothing. The trees stood still, their branches swaying faintly in the wind. Then she saw them. 3 figures moved silently between the trees, their bodies wrapped in dark cloaks that blended into the shadows. Their faces were hidden beneath metallic masks, the signature of Veloran hunters. Elias stood in the clearing, his staff held loosely at his side. One of the hunters stepped forward, his mask reflecting the pale moonlight. His voice, distorted by the mask, echoed through the clearing. "This doesn't concern you, human." Elias didn't flinch. "She's under my protection." The hunter chuckled darkly. "Protection? Is that what you call this?" He gestured toward the cave. "She's in exile. You know what happens to exiles, don't you? You can't save her." Elias's grip on his staff tightened, but he didn't move. "I only see 3 of you," Elias said calmly. "Where's the 4th?" Amara's eyes widened. She hadn't noticed anyone else. Then she felt it, the faint shift of air behind her. Before she could react, a cold blade pressed against her neck. "Smart," a voice whispered in her ear. "But not smart enough." Amara's blood ran cold. The 4th hunter had been in the cave all along. Elias's gaze shifted slightly, his eyes locking with Amara's through the cave entrance. For a brief moment, there was silence. Then Elias moved. He surged forward, his staff colliding with the nearest hunter's mask, shattering it with a single strike. The hunter staggered backward, blood streaming down his face. Amara didn't hesitate. She twisted sharply, slamming her elbow into the hunter behind her. The blade nicked her skin as she broke free, rolling across the cave floor and grabbing her own weapon. The hunter lunged toward her, but Amara met him head-on, driving her blade into his side. He grunted in pain, collapsing to the ground. By the time Amara emerged from the cave, Elias had already taken down the 2nd hunter. The 3rd hunter hesitated, his eyes flicking between Elias and Amara. "This isn't over," he growled, disappearing into the forest. Elias exhaled, lowering his staff. Amara wiped the blood from her blade, breathing heavily. "Why did they leave?" she asked. "They don't fight losing battles," Elias replied. "But they'll be back." Amara glanced at the fallen hunter near her feet. She had survived tonight. But something told her this was far from over. The sky above Veloranine was painted in deep shades of crimson and gold as the sun dipped below the jagged horizon. The forest had grown eerily silent since the attack, as if the shadows themselves mourned the blood spilled beneath their boughs. Amara sat by the smoldering remains of the fire, running her fingers over the shallow cut along her neck. The hunter's blade had been closer than she liked to admit. Elias knelt nearby, binding a wound on his forearm with rough cloth. Despite the fresh injury, his focus never wavered from the edge of the clearing. His eyes scanned the dark tree line, following every flicker of movement. "They'll return," Amara said softly, breaking the tense silence. Elias didn't look at her. Not tonight. But soon. Amara exhaled, frustration curling in her chest. "I can't keep running," she muttered. "If they're hunting me because of my family, they won't stop, no matter where I hide." Elias finally turned to her, his gaze calm but sharp. "Then don't hide." Amara frowned. "You think I should fight them?" "I think you should finish this," Elias replied. "Whatever you did to anger your family, whatever you stood against, own it. Show them you're not afraid." Amara hesitated. Her father's face surfaced in her mind, cold and unforgiving as he stripped her of her name and place within the clan. Standing against him had cost her everything. But Elias's words planted a seed she couldn't ignore. "What if?" Amara began, but her voice trailed off as a low hum filled the air. Elias's posture stiffened. His head tilted slightly, as if he could hear something she couldn't. "Do you hear that?" she asked. Elias didn't answer. He rose slowly, gripping his staff as the hum grew louder, vibrating through the ground beneath their feet. Amara's eyes scanned the forest. At first, she saw nothing. But then, lights. Glowing red lights bobbing between the trees, moving swiftly toward them. "Drones," Elias said, his jaw tightening. "They're searching the area." Amara's heart thudded painfully against her ribs. Velaran drones weren't just scouts. They were executioners. They must have called for reinforcements, Amara realized. "They're not going to let me escape this time." Elias's grip on his staff tightened. "Run." Amara hesitated. "But—" "Run, Amara," Elias said firmly, pushing her toward the path leading deeper into the forest. "I'll hold them off." "No," she snapped, pulling free. "I'm not leaving you here to die." Elias stared at her for a moment, something flickering behind his dark eyes. "You're stubborn," he muttered. "Fine. Then we do this together." The two of them sprinted through the dense underbrush, the hum of the drones growing louder behind them. The forest blurred as Amara pushed herself forward, adrenaline coursing through her veins. She could hear the distant hiss of energy bolts firing through the trees, scorching the ground as the drones closed in. Elias stayed at her side, moving with practiced speed, his staff glowing faintly in the dark. "We can't outrun them forever," Amara called over the noise. "I know," Elias replied. "We won't have to." Amara glanced at him, confused. "What does that mean?" Elias didn't answer immediately. Instead, he veered sharply to the left, pulling Amara with him. Ahead, the forest thinned, revealing a large canyon cutting through the landscape. At the edge of the canyon sat an old transport ship, half buried beneath a thick layer of vines and debris. Amara skidded to a stop. "That's my ship," Elias interrupted, already moving toward it. Amara followed, stumbling over the uneven ground. The vessel looked ancient, its hull covered in scorch marks and rust, but the faint glow of power still pulsed beneath the surface. Elias knelt by the side of the ship, pulling away the vines to reveal a hidden control panel. His fingers danced across the buttons, and with a low rumble, the ship's engines flickered to life. "You had a ship this whole time, and you never mentioned it?" Amara asked, disbelief in her voice. Elias shrugged. "Didn't think you'd need it. Now I do." Before Amara could respond, the hum of the drones grew deafening. She turned to see them emerging from the tree line, their sleek black forms cutting through the air like blades. "Elias," she shouted. "I see them," Elias replied, slamming his palm against the control panel. The ship's rear hatch hissed open, revealing the dark interior. "Get inside," Elias ordered. Amara didn't hesitate. She leaped onto the ramp, scrambling inside as energy bolts rained down around them. Elias followed, sealing the hatch behind him just as the first drone fired at the entrance. The blast rattled the ship, but the hull held firm. Inside, the cockpit flickered to life as Elias took the controls. The ship groaned as it slowly began to lift off the ground. Amara stood behind him, gripping the back of his chair. "Where are we going?" she asked. Elias's gaze hardened. "We're going to finish this." The ship soared above the forest, cutting through the clouds as the drones followed in pursuit. Amara watched them from the viewport, her pulse still racing. "They won't stop," she said quietly. "Not until I'm dead." Elias glanced at her. "Then we take the fight to them." Amara's eyes narrowed. "You have a plan." Elias's smirk returned. "I always have a plan." For the first time in days, Amara felt something she hadn't felt since leaving her family. Hope. The stars stretched endlessly across the void as Elias's ship hurtled through the night sky, leaving the dense forests of Valor far below. The hum of the engines filled the cockpit, steady and reassuring, but Amara's heart remained restless. She stood by the viewport, watching the planet shrink beneath them. Her reflection stared back at her, tired, bruised, and yet something was different. For the first time, the fear that had clung to her since her exile felt distant. Behind her, Elias worked quietly, adjusting the ship's trajectory and scanning the radar. His movements were fluid, practiced. The scars along his hands and jaw hinted at a lifetime spent surviving battles that most would flee from. Amara finally broke the silence. "You said we're taking the fight to them," she said, turning toward him. "What exactly does that mean?" Elias didn't glance up. "Your family's hunters work for your father. He's the one who sent them." Amara's jaw tightened. "I know." "Which means," Elias continued, "they report back to him. If we follow their signal, we can trace it to their base." Amara frowned. "And then what?" "Walk into their stronghold and hope they let us in." Elias's lips curved into a faint smirk. "Something like that." Amara shook her head. "That's suicide." "It's necessary," Elias replied calmly. "You can't run forever. If you want to survive, you need to confront him." His words struck a nerve. Amara crossed her arms, leaning against the wall. The memories of her father's cold stare resurfaced, the disappointment in his eyes when she defied him. Kellen Valora, the feared general of Valor, didn't tolerate disobedience. Amara had thought she could change his mind. She had been wrong. "I don't know if I can," Amara admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's not just my father. He's the most powerful figure on this planet." Elias finally looked at her, his gaze intense. "You stood against him once," he said. "That takes more strength than you realize." Amara met his eyes. For a moment, the silence between them felt heavier than the weight of the stars. Then, with a slow exhale, she nodded. "Fine," she said. "Let's finish this." The ship cut through the upper atmosphere, dipping back toward the planet's surface. Elias had traced the hunter's signal to an isolated fortress buried deep within Valor mountain range. Amara recognized it immediately, her family's ancestral stronghold. It was a towering structure carved directly into the cliffs, hidden from view by thick fog and the jagged peaks that surrounded it. The fortress was both a military base and a sanctuary, known only to those with the bloodline to access it. Amara hadn't been there in years. As the fortress came into view, Elias slowed the ship, hovering just above the outer perimeter. "This is as close as we get without triggering their defenses," Elias said, locking the controls. "We go in on foot from here." Amara secured her blade, feeling the comforting weight of the weapon against her hip. "You sure about this?" Elias asked, watching her carefully. Amara nodded, determination settling in her chest. "I have to be." The climb up the mountain was treacherous, but the path was familiar to Amara. She led Elias along narrow trails carved into the rock, each step bringing them closer to the fortress gates. The mist clung to the cliffs, shrouding them in ghostly white as the wind howled through the peaks. By the time they reached the outer wall, the sun had begun to rise, casting faint light across the stone battlements. Elias knelt by the gate's control panel, scanning its surface with a small device. "Locked," he muttered. Figures. Amara stepped forward, pressing her palm against the cold metal. The panel flickered to life. A small green light scanned her hand, and with a soft hiss, the gate began to open. Elias raised an eyebrow. Impressive. I'm still blood, Amara said quietly. They won't lock me out. Not yet, at least. The fortress was silent as they slipped inside, moving like shadows between the stone corridors. Amara's footsteps echoed faintly, but the halls remained empty. It wasn't until they reached the central chamber that the first sign of life emerged. A guard stood by the entrance, his back turned. Elias moved swiftly, striking the guard at the base of the neck with the butt of his staff. The man crumpled without a sound. They pressed on, weaving through the corridors until they reached the command hall. Amara stopped outside the heavy doors, her heart pounding. Her father was inside. She could feel it. Elias glanced at her, his eyes asking a silent question. Amara took a breath, gripping the handle. She pushed the doors open. Callan Valora stood at the far end of the room, staring out through the large window that overlooked the mountains. He didn't turn when they entered. I wondered how long it would take you to come back, Callan said, his voice calm and measured. Amara stepped forward, her footsteps echoing across the polished floor. You sent hunters after me, she said coldly. Callan finally turned to face her, his eyes, piercing and unforgiving, locked onto hers. You left me no choice, he replied. You defied this family. I protected innocent people, Amara snapped. Callan's gaze hardened. You betrayed your blood. Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Then Elias spoke. She's not the one who betrayed this family, Elias said, stepping beside Amara. You did. Callan's eyes narrowed. You must be the human mercenary I've heard about, he said. You should choose your alliances more carefully. Elias smirked. I like the ones I've chosen just fine. Callan's expression darkened. You have no place here. Amara stepped forward, her voice steady. I do. Callan stared at her for a long moment, and for the first time, Amara saw something shift in his eyes. Recognition, respect, and perhaps regret. But it was fleeting. This isn't over, Callan said. Amara met his gaze without flinching. No, she replied. It's just beginning. Amara stood before her father, the tension in the air thick enough to shatter glass. The cold walls of the command hall loomed around them, and the faint hum of the fortress systems pulsed like a heartbeat beneath the floor. Elias remained by her side, his staff resting lightly in his hand, but his eyes never left Callan Valora. Callan's gaze shifted between them, lingering on Amara. Though his expression remained unreadable, there was a weight in his stare that hadn't been there before. A realization, perhaps, that his daughter was no longer the naive girl he had exiled. You believe defying me has made you stronger, Callan said, his voice as cold as the steel walls around them. Amara met his gaze without flinching. No, I became stronger because I had to survive without you. Her words echoed through the chamber, striking with the force of a hammer. For a brief moment, Callan's eyes narrowed, but Amara saw it, the faintest flicker of uncertainty beneath his mask of control. Elias took a step forward, leaning casually on his staff. She's not the same person you cast out, Valora. I think you can see that. Callan's lips pressed into a thin line. You speak as if you know my daughter. I know survivors, Elias replied smoothly. She fits the description. Amara glanced at Elias, grateful for his presence but knowing this confrontation wasn't his to fight. She stepped closer to her father, closing the space between them. You trained me to be ruthless, she said quietly. You thought strength was measured by how many enemies you crushed. But strength isn't about domination, father. It's about protecting those who can't protect themselves. Callan's jaw tightened. That weakness will get you killed. No, Amara replied firmly. That weakness is why I'm still standing here. It's why I'm not broken. Callan said nothing. His gaze bore into hers, searching for cracks in her resolve. But Amara didn't waver. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant hum of the fortress's energy systems. Finally, Kalen exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering by the slightest degree. "You've changed," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "I had to," Amara replied. Kalen's eyes drifted to Elias once more. "And this human? He saved me when no one else would," Amara answered. "He stood by me when you sent hunters to end my life." Kalen's gaze hardened. "You were a threat to this family's name. I acted as any leader would." "No," Amara said. "You acted as a man afraid of losing control." The words hung heavily in the air, but Amara didn't regret them. For the first time, she saw her father not as the untouchable general of Valor, but as a man weighed down by the fear of losing his legacy. And for the first time, she felt free. Kalen stepped back, folding his arms behind his back. "You came here seeking something," he said. "What is it you want, Amara?" Amara straightened, feeling the heat of Elias's silent support beside her. "I want my name back," she said. "I want the right to walk this world without being hunted by my own blood." Kalen's gaze flickered, unreadable as ever. "And if I refuse?" Amara's hand drifted toward the blade at her waist, not as a threat, but as a reminder. "Then I'll carve my own path," she replied, "with or without your approval." The chamber fell into silence once more, but this time it was Kalen who broke it. "You remind me of your mother," he said quietly, his eyes softening for the briefest of moments. She was stubborn too. Amara's heart skipped at the mention of her mother, a figure rarely spoken of in their household. "I'll consider your request," Kalen said, turning toward the window. "But know this, Amara, if you stand against this family again, I will not hesitate to finish what I started." Amara nodded, accepting his terms without hesitation. "I understand." Elias tapped his staff lightly against the floor. "Sounds fair enough," he muttered under his breath. Kalen's gaze lingered on them one final time before he waved his hand dismissively. "Leave, before I change my mind." Amara didn't wait for him to reconsider. She turned on her heel, Elias following closely behind, as they exited the command hall. The cold mountain air hit them as they stepped outside the fortress gates, the wind whipping through the narrow paths that led down the cliffs. Elias glanced sideways at Amara. "Well, that went better than I expected." Amara huffed out a soft laugh, feeling the tension finally begin to ease from her shoulders. "I think he respects you now," Elias added. "I don't need his respect," Amara replied. "I just need him to leave me alone." Elias nodded thoughtfully. "That's one way to reclaim your dignity." They continued down the trail, the fortress fading into the mist behind them. As they walked, Amara glanced toward Elias. "You didn't have to stay by my side," she said. "But you did." "Why?" Elias smirked. "Because you remind me of someone I used to know, a long time ago." Amara raised an eyebrow. "And who was that?" Elias's gaze drifted toward the horizon, his expression unreadable. "Someone who didn't give up when the world told her to," he said softly. Amara didn't press for more. As they descended the mountain, a sense of peace settled over her, a peace she hadn't felt since the day she was cast out. Her path forward wasn't clear, and there were battles yet to come. But for the first time, Amara knew she wasn't alone, and that was enough.